Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll give it about a minute for everyone to join. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Molly Lacob. I'm the Global Social Impact Manager at USTOA. We're very excited to be back for our second session of the SIR Education series. We had one back in August, our very first one. So to those of you who attended last month, welcome back. And to those of you who are new here, this series was created to give our members a peer learning experience. So we know that everyone under the USTOA umbrella and the Tourism Cares umbrella has a lot of experience in sustainability, and we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to learn from that and also share their successes, their hurdles. So we created this out of these focus areas and these themes that our members said they wanted to learn more about and discuss. This month, we are very thrilled to partner with Tourism Cares, whose mission and work we value and admire very much. Tourism Cares is the absolute perfect partner to lead today's discussion, which is all about integrating meaningful travel into the supply chain. A big thank you to our sponsor, TripMate, who is always very supportive of the USTOA sustainability mission. I'll go ahead and pass over to John.
Thank you, Molly. So I'm John Sutherland, everybody. I'm the Director of Community Impact for Tourism Cares. And I have the privilege today of introducing our panelists for the session. We're really excited to have a diverse panel of different perspectives and different locations around the globe to join us today. So in no particular order, I'll start with Daniel Turner. He's the co-founder and director of Ana Mondial. Daniel's an environmental biologist who's worked with the global travel industry for over 2 decades, initially as a tourism lead at the Born Free Foundation, and most recently as co-founder of the specialist consultancy Ana Mondial, which is a partner of ours. Taking a more pragmatic approach, he's been at the forefront of travel and tourism guidance and policy development and advocates animal-friendly, nature-positive travel where tourism is part of the solution. Next, we have Poonam Rawat Hanna. Poonam's a consultant focusing on adventure, regenerative, and transformational tourism product design, development, and execution, while positively impacting the communities and environment. In 2009, she founded a community-based tourism enterprise, Fernway Fair Travel Uplifting Communities, which is a women-led and run award-winning and internationally recognized youth and women empowerment project. Fernway offers small group guided tours to B2B partners that integrate nature-based adventures and well-being retreats with indigenous cultural activities in the Indian Himalayas. Next is Colin Heinrich, the Associate Director, Global Impact at Indagare. Colin's an avid writer, conservationist, and world explorer with over 10 years in the travel industry, first as a freelance writer for publications around the world, then as a trip designer at a boutique high-end travel agency in New York, and now as a leader in the development of policy in a time when travel has taken center stage in the conversation about the climate emergency and social responsibility. And last but not least is Matt Berna, President and Managing Director of the Americas for Intrepid Travel and a Tourism Cares board member. Matt started his career in travel as a tour leader 30 years ago and has since worked with some of the world's leading tour operators across a range of senior sales and business development roles. As the president and managing director of the Americas based in California, he oversees Intrepid's direct industry and white label sales, as well as operations across North, Central, and South America. So that's our panel. We're really fortunate to have you. Thank you all for joining us, taking the time out of your day today. And now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Paula Blamings, our Chief Impact Officer, to give a little bit of an overview. Take it away, Paula. And Paula, you're on mute.
How about that? I'll unmute myself. That'll be a big help. Thanks, John. And I just wanted to make sure that everybody can see my screen. And so before we move over to our panelists, I just wanted to give a kind of a brief overview to touch base about the importance not only of a shift in thinking, but the opportunity of a shift in thinking about our supply chains, a shift to a tourism value chain that includes the social, economic, and environmental value, where all your suppliers and all your stakeholders in particular are included to better understand your impacts and use your relationships with your suppliers to drive positive change. And in that way, to take action on these key environmental and social issues that are affecting your business. And so I think the concept of leakage is one that's very familiar to most of us on the Zoom, but many local people and nature and wildlife that we depend on are not benefiting from tourism. And this is where the tourism assets are derived at the end of the day. It's the culture and the wildlife and a sense of place. I mean, this is what we sell. And so by establishing deeper, more long-term relationships with locally owned businesses and supporting local impact organizations and social enterprises, it tackles this big problem of leakage, and it leaves more money in the local community. And why is that important? Well, if we want thriving communities and we want wildlife to exist, then they need to benefit, and they need to benefit from our tourism dollars. So the more your choices include locally owned and operated goods and services providers, the more considerable benefit that becomes for the local communities. But if you exclude really local goods and services, then the impact is really actually quite negligible. Supporting and scaling local businesses also helps with the problem of migration, which is the culture bearers of our community, climate adaptation, and it creates a multiplier effect for other economic sectors and communities. So what does a meaningful value chain look like? Well, we say this a lot at Tourism Cares. Every traveler eats, sleeps, shops, tours, and needs transport. And every one of those touch points is an opportunity to create positive change for the destination and a more meaningful experience for your travelers. And there are impact partners working in every corner of the world that could be linked or could be better linked to the tourism supply chain. So I just want to touch on a couple of them. Where you send travelers for your meals can be positively impacting that destination. We've worked with quite a few different restaurants and programs over the years. And so one of them is Cafe Reconcile in New Orleans. It's a catering and restaurant that's in this incredible neighborhood, and they are a community that supports youth victims of violence. And just this week, they were named New York Times 50 Best Restaurants in America. So these are really wonderful culinary experiences as well. We've worked with Choco Bar in Puerto Rico and downtown San Juan, Puerto Rico. They have a foundation that supports emerging artists, as well as a historical foundation for Puerto Rican art. And they are also a very interesting culinary experience. And then we worked for a long time with the Paro Community Restaurant in the Sacred Valley. It's a community-owned, community-benefited restaurant trained with chefs trained from top chefs in Lima. It's a beautiful setting, and it's just off the beaten path in the Sacred Valley, where they weren't typically benefiting from tourism, and now they are, once they've been able to really connect with the travel trade. Another place, of course, that's really important to the tourism supply chain is accommodation. And there are thousands and thousands of small and medium locally owned hotels and homestays, from luxury to budget, that keep money in the local community. And many of them operate more sustainably than some of these big fancy hotels with their certifications, because it's quite costly to get the certification process done. But I would look for those smaller ones first, because that money stays in the community and that creates that multiplier effect. But beyond the locally owned, there are, of course, plenty of accommodations out there that with certifications or verifiable sustainable practices. And if we can start moving all of our accommodations to support local communities and the environment, that ripple effect is huge. And there's many, many of them out there, and even more coming on the market every day. Experiences and tours are particularly poised to create impact and product differentiation. This is just one that I've been on in Amsterdam. It's a tour with a social enterprise called the Plastic Whale that takes travelers fishing for plastic on the canals, and then that plastic gets turned into these beautiful design furniture and these boats that you go out in. So just to touch on the issue of plastic waste before we move on, and how it relates to our business. So the blue economy is a very important one to tourism. About 80% of all tourism takes place in coastal areas. And coral reef tourism alone generates $36 billion in economic revenue for our industry. But these reefs are in serious trouble, and plastics remains a huge threat to all ocean life. So shouldn't we, or couldn't we, all be working with only responsible suppliers that are reducing or eliminating plastics? and working with impact organizations on the ground who are creating these kinds of experiences and tours for our travelers to combat these problems. It's certainly for our own good as a business, and it's certainly good for the planet. So these headlines about plastics, I know, have sort of disappeared from the radar, but the plastic has not. And the way we can start to imagine how we create these connections and these linkages to our suppliers who are tackling these issues, the better off we all will be in the end. And before I turn it back over to John to start our conversation with our travelers, or with our panelists about our travelers, I just wanted to end with this quote from Arnie Weissman, who is a former Tourism Cares board member of ours. And he wrote this in an article, and it continues to stay with us. It says, if we who profit from the desire of people to experience the world don't also invest in preserving and protecting and revitalizing the places that we send travelers, we don't have sustainable business models. So as we move into this conversation, I want us to continuously think about, how do we use your purchasing power in the travel industry by being intentional and innovative with your supply chain, so that we can change communities and ecosystems for the better, because that's certainly better for our business. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back over to John and open up this conversation and this dialogue with our panelists.
Thank you, Paula. So we're going to start with Poonam. Poonam, in talking to you a few weeks ago, I was really inspired by the work that you're doing, kind of being in a community, noticing some social issues that were going on, and then thinking of the way that you could use tourism to get to the bottom of those. Can you take a few minutes and share with our community here kind of that process of what you did in setting up your community-based tourism organization, what impacts you've seen from that, and give our audience a little bit of an understanding of why they should care about what they do with their supply chains.
Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm going to try to tell you the story in really short, because if I'm going to start talking, it's going to take hours. This happened in 2009. A girl who was 21 years old, she had 2 daughters and she was pregnant. She came to me and she said, can you help me? My husband's dead, yeah? And in these villages in Himalayas, you can never marry again. I was like, yeah, just come to my mom's house, you can stay here and, just help you here. She said, no, I cannot move away from my in-laws house, because in Himalayas, I don't know how it is in the other parts, but in Himalayas, Indian Himalayas, once you're married, you are like slaves for your in-laws. They are doing all the work, the field work, looking after the animals, looking after the house, everything. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. If you can't come here, I can't help you. I cannot go to your village. She left and I couldn't sleep that night, because in my head, it was like 21-year-old. She was pregnant, a widow, 2 daughters. What will she do? Next morning, I woke up, I drove around, I did my research, and I found out that in our area, we had an alarming number of young widows and victims of domestic violence. And that was the moment I was like, okay, I need to do something. I need to find a solution. So most of the community-based tourism, they start like this. If there is a problem, that's the best way to do it. If there's a problem, you find the solution. It took me, I spoke to the girls, the women, they were really excited, but it took me 5 years to convince the communities to actually let these women work. So after 5 years, everything happened. We created really immersive, deep experiences. It's not like I told them what they have to do. They just have to be welcoming and, share their lives with the guest, be very authentic. That's all they had to do. And we created various accommodation. Okay, now we are in 2023. This community-based tourism has been life-changing for all the women there. In our company, 98% of our, team, we are women. Just to give an example, a 10-day trip, 12 people, you impact 557 people, and 507 are only women. So, this is not only life-changing and transformational for the locals, but it is even an amazing transformational experience for the guest, because they get to form these beautiful connections. They're heart-to-heart connections. This is not something, like mass tourism. So you need to keep it authentic. And lives of these women or these communities, they have transformed. They have, better education. They have better health benefits. They have cleaner villages. They are able to take care of their forest, because every place they have their own forest, and they know how to take care of their environment. And we are off the beaten path. So I think to work directly with community-based tourism is one of the best things to do to really impact not only the communities, but also our guests. Because when these guests, they leave, they are very emotional. They get so connected to the locals, they are hugging, and they keep coming back. So this is much more than tourism or travel. This is more heart to soul connection. Thank you.
That's an amazing story, Poonam, and I think we'd love to dive into sort of the mechanics of that as well, because I think this is where the relationship and the partnership building has to happen. And so, Matt, if we could just go to you, and let's say a company decides it really does care about infusing sustainability and meaning into its product. What are some of the keys to actually operationalizing it? And coming from a larger company, I think you'll have a more broad view about that. So can you dive into that a little bit for us?
Sure. Thanks, Paula, and some fantastic storytelling from Panana, because it's so important, the community-based tourism piece. And it's part of what we do as well. So I think this might sound really obvious. Management team decided, okay, we want to start down this path, but you still need engagement of your staff, your suppliers, and suppliers could be someone we work with directly. In Intrepid's case, maybe our own DMCs, and the staff in those DMCs that work for us, because they have relationships on the ground. So they have special interest. It could be climate, societal-based, community engagement, social enterprise. So we generally start there. Where is our focus as a business, not just from the top down, but really from all levels. But really, as importantly, I suppose, is to look where the money flow goes. We talked about 5% leakage. I haven't seen that stat before. It's shocking to me, honestly, to hear that, and something I'll refer to going forward. Our aim is to keep at least 60% of the travelers' dollars within the market. So again, how do you do that? A lot of it is through our contracting procurement. So that's through the hotels, the transport providers, the local staff. And then to have an impact really beyond that, think about really how you use those contracting procurement strategies. So working with BIPOC, women, First Nations owned businesses and suppliers is where we take that first approach. If I can give you an example, Intrepid created a series of trips in Australia a couple of years ago, pretty much based on the fact they couldn't travel outside Australia. And we actively wanted to engage with the First Nations people in Australia as part of our Reconciliation Action Plan. So we engaged with them. A lot of the businesses, as you mentioned, Paula, weren't really tourism ready. So we had discussion about whether they wanted to see tourism, what would that look like if it did. And then we proactively set a goal for ourselves. We had over 80 itineraries. We said, okay, every itinerary is going to have a First Nations experience featured, highlighted, and built into the itinerary. And so through that, we could say, okay, we are going to develop products around this. So the important part for us was that we committed to scale, not just dipping our toes in. We engaged with those suppliers on the ground to understand that they were market ready, not to overpromise, but make sure they understood the relationship and what we'd expect from them as well. And then it's really important because you want to be able to talk to your successes, your achievements, your challenges as you go down this path. And so it's really important to have a starting position. We always talk about you can't manage what you don't measure. So have a starting position. And this grace was quite easy because we did very little with First Nations people before. But I can tell you within 2 years, through the number of trips we operated and those experiences, we were delivering over $500,000 into those First Nation providers, suppliers within 2 years. So we can go back and report that. And that really does kind of help propel the engagement with all your stakeholders within your team and your customers particularly, and certainly encourages the suppliers they're on something that's really positive for them as well. So I think really thinking about where you spend your money, you think consciously about that contracting piece. And your point you made, Paul, a really good thing is look for maybe some non-traditional, non-obvious kind of partnerships. Again, restaurants that are served by disadvantaged youth, restaurants, food is a fantastic way to learn about culture and support those local economies. So just be creative as well. I better stop there because I could probably give you a lot more examples, but I think those are some real kind of clear things that we like to actively think about doing and try to achieve on a daily level.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Matt. And I think using the example of reconciliation and working with Indigenous organizations is spot on. That really goes to how you can use your supply chain to to drive positive social impacts. And the consultation process was so important to that. And I do kind of want to get into this concept maybe later of the committing to scale versus dipping your toe in, and where we might recommend some of the some of the tour suppliers on the call start. So let's keep that in the back of our heads for later. But for the moment, let's switch over to Daniel from Anna Mundial and maybe take a little bit of a different example. So Matt talked about working with indigenous organizations, reconciliation. Daniel, I know you really focus heavily on nature positive tourism, and that you've got tons of experience working with travel businesses. So what would you tell the travel trade about what they can do with their supply chain to reduce negative impacts, to increase positive ones, kind of through the lens of nature positive tourism as an example? What are some of the recommendations that you give to businesses?
Thanks, John, and thank you to Tourism Cares for this opportunity. I think I'd just like to kind of turn that question on its head a little bit, and almost sort of explain why we need to look at our supply chains, why we need to look at our direct and indirect operations. The fact of the matter is, right now, we have a decline in about 70% of wildlife abundance. So we've seen wildlife populations down by 2/3 since 1970. That is, we're seeing 1 in 4 species, so these are animals and plant species, 1 in 4 facing extinction. Never to be seen again. This is the largest decline in human history. And whilst that might mean losing, or will mean losing, animals that we never knew exist, this has huge implications on the stability of ecosystems. Now, without getting too technical, ecosystems are the engine rooms of nature. They are the physical elements of nature, so the air and soil and water, and their interaction with all the living things, which we refer to as biodiversity. And those two interactions we often refer to as ecosystem services. They provide the air that we breathe, the fresh water, our food, regulates our climate, protects us from disease, literally everything that ensures our well-being, our prosperity, and our survival. And so if we continue to see a loss in biodiversity, we continue to see instability in ecosystems, then we are literally threatening everything that we hold dear to ourselves, our security, our survival, and that of all the other animals and plants on this planet. So that's the reason why we need to be sustainable. That's the reason why we need to really pick apart our direct and indirect operations and identify where our dependencies on nature are and where our impacts on nature are, and then to avoid, ideally, but if not, to minimize those impacts as much as possible. And those impacts that we can't avoid, we need to find ways to compensate for that impact by building back nature or restoring nature in the destinations that we visit. So in answer to your question, it's basically we need to think about how we're contributing to biodiversity loss and to try and minimize that contribution to biodiversity loss. If we don't, then there won't be tourism, but there won't be anything else either.
Thank you, Daniel. I had a leading scientist a couple of months say to me that every time we take a wild animal out of the wild, we put a pinprick into our spacesuit spacesuit that is Earth. And I think when we look at extinct species, we probably are ripping a gaping hole into our spaceship that is Earth. And so with that, I'd love to get back, once we circle around, to some of the opportunities for tourism to really plug into nature positive resources. But before we do, Colin, I just wanted to touch base with you. Matt comes from a very large tour operator. You come from a much smaller one, more boutique. And so I wanted to sort of ask you, that's been a recent transition. And can you give a little bit of your story in terms of how your company has gone to really shifting much more to a sustainability mindset and business model?
Yeah, so it's a good question, but what I would also say is that the difference between a large organization and a small organization is actually pretty small. What a small organization has a little bit of trouble with is beginning the process. Obviously, a larger organization has a little bit more momentum and thus has more difficulty beginning the process as well. But it comes down to finding the capital, finding the funds to really begin figuring out your processes. But what I would say before that, it's all about figuring out what you stand for to begin with. And once you know what you stand for, once you know what kind of impact you want to have, at that point, it's as simple as setting up initiatives that speak to you, looking at other organizations. And I think that there is an aspect of cooperation where typically you would expect competition between certain organizations. But when it comes to impact, I think cooperation is something that most people are very willing to do. When it comes to figuring out what you stand for, Indigari in particular has 3 pillars of impact. And Matt has talked a little bit about the importance of cultural heritage and involving First Nations people. Obviously, Daniel has talked a lot about involving nature. We are under the impression that all of these things are related. So culture, community, nature, it's not pillars, it's a braid. And you can't necessarily protect one without protecting the other. And so as we set up our initiatives, we really focus on what is going to be able to accomplish all 3 at once. What's going to be able to develop this community? What's going to involve the local people? What's going to protect nature? And then it's as simple as starting, frankly, having the courage to start. Every organization, large and small, has their profit margin, has a certain amount of money that they make. And it's as simple as, building into your future plans how to allocate some of that to the important initiatives that you've then ideated and figured out are important to you and to the world. So that's a long-winded way to say, when it comes to how does an organization, large or small, start, it's just having the courage to do so.
Great, thank you, Colin. John, did you have a question or do you want me to jump in?
I think you should jump in at this point, but just a reminder to the audience to pop your questions into the chat or into the FAQ, and we'll try to get the panelists to either answer them in real time or perhaps just answer them in the chat.
Sounds good. I think one of the things that would be really interesting is for Poonam and Daniel, having 2 tour operators here on the call, is to maybe dive into a little bit about how you work with tour operators. How does this relationship come to be, and certainly what are the challenges and the opportunities? So Daniel, if you could give us a little bit on what would you tell the tour operators on this call about how to get more nature positive supply chain shifting going on?
Well, I think it's sort of building on the introduction that I gave. It's really about understanding the tour operator, because as we've heard, is that whilst they may approach sustainability in the same way, they do offer different product. They do, I think Colin is representing a travel agent, and Intrepid is more of a tour operator. So they have different ways of potentially impacting on the environment. Intrepid having more direct impact and the travel agent having more indirect impact. So there will be different ways of addressing the problems. And And that's what I think is slightly the wrong approach with sustainability. Is quite often it's kind of a one approach fits all, and I'm afraid that's not the case at all. We have to understand business, the destinations it goes to, how it interacts with the community or not, and then we can kind of pick apart where how they are contributing to the impacts, the drivers of biodiversity loss, and how they depend on nature, and that way we then look at the mitigating actions. I suppose one of the areas that is kind of my initial hat that before I got into all of this nature positive tourism stuff, which has been sort of a year old, I suppose, is what I was doing before that, which was very much on animal welfare. And animal welfare is seen as one of those kind of ethical approaches to take, whereas actually it's fundamental. If you don't understand what a mouse needs to what an elephant needs, and ensures that those animals are kept in the best conditions, whether that's in the wild or in captivity, then you're never going to protect the animal, let alone the species. So all these issues, as Colin was saying, are interconnected. And actually, yes, you can join the dots between the two, but if you between all of the elements, but if you don't have a healthy biosphere, so that's the planet, then you're not going to have anything. And so we desperately need to focus on that element as a priority, being a little bit disruptive, but that is the reality, I'm afraid.
No, and I think the opportunity then, of course, is what are those supply chain touch points where that can be integrated into the tourism supply chain. And I think that's where the interesting piece is, where it isn't one size fit all. It definitely depends on the country and the species and the experience. And so Poonam, you were definitely shaking your head that one size does not fit all. Can you share a little bit of your story about that as well?
See, we work only B2B, and we work with the companies where our values totally align, because we are getting guests to our communities. We want these people to behave in a certain way. It's an exchange. You know, if the guests are respecting the locals will in return respect them. So we have to be very careful when we enter a country. You know, like you always say, when you don't know what to do, just look around what are locals doing and just follow them. Wear the clothes the way they are dressed up. Simple, because I work at grassroots. We have created everything from grassroots, and I'm very careful whom I work with. You know, we need good travelers coming, not tourism, you know, and we do not want mass tourism in our off the beaten path. So that's you know, so whatever Daniel said, I totally agree. You know, quality, we need quality, not quantity. And to be sustainable, like I shared last time, 15 trips per year, that's enough. That's enough for all the women to be sustainable. And that way, our experiences, they stay unique and authentic. You know, that's why we choose who we work with.
Yeah, and I think that is always the push-pull between volume and quality. And I think, you know, as we come out of the pandemic and the gates are open, I think we're seeing a big desire for this kind of travel, but also a real sensitivity to too much can be far too much. We have a couple questions here for you, Matt. Really looking at, you know, how do we, let me just see, how do we build these experiences with smaller suppliers that really lack, you know, the proper training or insurance or liabilities, and that's really required for larger tour operators. And maybe Colin, you could touch on that a little bit too.
Sure, it's an interesting question, because part of my job, of course, looking over operations across the Americas. Unfortunately, we have incidents and accidents, and I can tell you almost always it's the weakest chain in the link, or link in the chain, where the expression is, and it typically can be a small operator who, you know, just they're performing as they may typically perform, but one little incident happens and you are exposed. So it's a really good question. We do a very thorough health and safety assessments at different levels. So we first quantify at a trip level. Imagine, is this trip safe? So this customer base, it's a typical Intrepid customer, should they be in this environment in the first place, right? Is it safe? So that kind of high level assessment. You start breaking down piece by piece, and we'll have on-trip assessments, meaning that we will go through and vet every supplier on that chain. I think Colin mentioned there's a cost to some of the sustainability work. A lot of the times there are obviously the clear benefits, but sometimes there are fixed costs in terms of the time it takes to properly go out and assess on the ground. Now, we don't have to assess every operator. We have low, middle, high risk, but anything from medium to high risk, we want to see business licenses, insurance. High risk will be on site, and looking at if it's a rafting company, are they trained, qualified, the first aid plan. So there's a bit of work has to be done at that on the ground level. We would typically shy away from working operators we haven't had that relationship with or had that kind of engagement with in terms of that assessment. So if you are a large tour operator sitting on this call, again, you are very much, unfortunately, at a liability risk and a reputational risk, and of course your customer safety risk if you're not being thorough in the assessment piece, because it can be a small boat operator, from a local hotel, a local transport provider without seatbelts, whatever it might be. So unfortunately, that's one of the very non-of-interest things about the venture travel. But as much as we can control that, we try to, without, of course, changing the client experience of being spontaneous and adventurous on the ground. So we have to live with a sense of risk, but we try to control as much as we can around that, because it does and can create issues for you and your customers.
Yep. Great, Matt. Thank you. I think we have a couple questions about the gap between what travelers say they want and what they actually do in terms of the cost differential, and also measurement. How do we measure our impact? And that can certainly go to all four of the panelists. Like, how do we know that we're making a difference, and how do we know that it's good for our business? So Colin, do you want to take that one for us?
Yeah, I'll start by addressing the say-do gap. And I would say that, fair caveat that my organization does tend to service a little higher end travel. But what I would say is that the say-do gap is actually a little smaller than you would expect, just because the amount of money that you need to make an impact at scale is relatively small on a per trip basis. And so what we found is that as something as little as a price increase of 0.5% is enough to have huge ramifications over the course of the number of trips that you run as an operator. And when you have that sort of capital and you are addressing, this also speaks to the measurement question, if you're focusing on a hyper local scale, commensurate with the impact that you believe that you can have, you are able to track the impact that you're having quite easily. So the example that I'll give is that at Indagare, we fully fund a project in Zimbabwe called the Long Shield Lion Guardians. It's a community development and conservation project outside of Hwange National Park that's focused on human-wildlife conflict reduction. We fund that project in full over the course of the year for $120,000, which is a lot of money for a lot of organizations. But as we figure out how to fund that, it actually doesn't represent a huge portion of any given trip that we do. And so what we're able to do is, because it's a small organization, it operates only in this one area with about 800 households, we're able to track the very specific number of lions in the region. We're able to track the community attitude towards lions. We're able to track the rate at the decline of poaching in the area. All of these things we're able to track because it is a project at the scale that we feel like we can have an impact on without necessarily having to overcharge our customers in order to fund it. So what we've also found is that the say-do gap, and again, this is also not necessarily representative of everybody, but that 0.5% that people can afford, prices are going up. I mean, inflation is a huge issue right now, but what we found is that travel remains, even as the cost of everything goes up, travel remains one of the few things that people are always willing to pay for. And so as these costs go up, I do think that they remain very competitive while still being able to have the impact that you want them to have.
Thank you, Colin. I think there's also an understanding now that we just have to build our product more sustainably, that we don't necessarily have to tell the traveler that they're buying a sustainable product, but that it's just built in, and that sustainability has to become much more of a management tool and not something that we market. And so that we are creating tourism that is good for our communities as well as our products. So I think that say-do gap is often something of a misnomer for me, in that for so many years, it's how do we start to just build this product more sustainably because we need it for our businesses. And so that becomes sort of a bit more of a non-issue. And anyone else want to jump in on this issue of measurement?
I'd love to hear.
want
I'd love to hear Daniel. Yeah, because
Yeah.
I know you have some tools that tour operators can use to measure specifically nature positivity, but maybe you have something else to say as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to what you were saying there, Paula, because I think that's you know, a lot of companies struggle with where to kind of focus positively, and I get the sense that it's a little bit like a scattergun approach, kind of to see what sticks, and then they'll stick with that element, and it shouldn't be as well as difficult as that, really, because you're all selling product in lots of different destinations, and within those destinations there are opportunities where you can not just build back nature, which is part of this nature positive tourism agenda, but you can also support local livelihoods. You can bring back culture to an area that you know, that lost that culture. So there's a lot of elements that you can tie together in a positive experience that ultimately is building back nature and offsetting any unavoidable impact. So you can tie all these things together. There's too much siloing going on, where people are looking at the different issues and kind of saying, well, I'm going to focus on social elements, environmental stuff is not for me, or I'm only interested in animal welfare and I'm not interested in human welfare. Well, all of these things are connected, and the best way to address all of those impacts is to combine it into projects and initiatives. And I think tourism can be a real driver of that, and bring back a lot of what is lost in the destinations, which we're all trying to do. So that's really the driving force of nature positive tourism. As far as the measurement, I mean, it is difficult to measure impact because, of course, as I was saying before, it depends whether it's direct or whether it's indirect, or on the destination itself, or depending on what the activity is. I mean, there's so many variables. How do you measure it? Well, at Animundial, we created a tool which is just about to be launched, actually, which brings together all the different scientific based targets and recommendations and guidelines into an evaluation tool. So a travel business, no matter their size, no matter their specialism, can go through that assessment tool, and they will be able to identify what their impacts and dependencies are, which is now the legal requirement on all business, not just travel businesses. And they can also receive a printout, if you like, of all the priority actions relevant to their business. So it's not a case of, you know, overload as far as I need to focus on plastics and people and environment and I don't know what carbon. We will identify the priority actions that are relevant to your business, so you'll be able to tackle the biggest impacts first, and then the nice to haves later. And then it makes it a lot easier for a business to navigate this whole nature positive sustainability maze.
Hey, Daniel, can I ask you a question? Put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a really clever tool and so important that we're measuring that type of impact. And in my view, particularly on conservation, nature-based travel, is not just the impact whilst on the trip. It's hopefully that lasting impression and that ongoing concern for conservation when they get home. So I guess the question too is there anything in that mechanism or tool that can start to look at the ongoing social impact that experience has had on the trip? Because that's where I think we're all struggling. We know we're doing good things, like I said, conservation-based, climate-based, carbon reduction, but how do we measure that ongoing value piece? Can we?
Well, I think it's all about opinions. So there's a lot of surveys out there as far as what people value most. I think travel and tourism, particularly immersive tourism, generates that positive opinion. I think also certainly in the tool, it will ask what interactions you have with the local community and whether you whether there's a skill sharing, knowledge sharing, whether you provide opportunities for your travelers to really understand the environment and to learn from local people who care for the environment and why they care for the environment. So as long as you facilitate that educational experience, then ultimately you will have, and the evidence is there already, it doesn't really need to be measured, that people do come back with those positive sentiments of wanting to do more. But I think travel and tourism is not there yet. I mean, there are some trailblazers, and maybe you work for one of them, but there are 95% of travel businesses that are not even thinking about sustainability, let alone nature positive, which is trying to get a net positive outcome to your actions. So there's a long way to go, and that's why we're working with the UN, WTO, WTTC, and SHA to really push this nature positive agenda.
Great, thanks, Dan.
Don, I think we're running close to time. I think we had one more question for Poonam that you wanted to lob over to her.
Yeah, sure. Maybe you can sort of take us home with this, Poonam, but maybe there'll be a couple minutes too for any additional questions or comments from our panelists. But you know, when we've talked before in preparation for this conversation, you talk about a transformational journey for the guests that are coming through on those 15 trips per year. And I just wanted to get a sense from you, like what that means. Tourism Cares, we talk about kind of meaningful travel that has a certain sense to it, but what is transformational travel to you? And you know, based on the discussion we've had today, how would you recommend that, you know, the tour operators that are part of the USTOA community, for instance, go about trying to use community-based tourism as a way to transform their guests and build loyalty and that sort of thing?
So transformational travel, it's both ways, communities and the guests. When the guests are coming to us or any community-based tourism, they get to experience like really deep cultural and nature immersion, and they are interacting, you know, they are forming these connections with the locals where they learn about a total different life, which they could never imagine that it lasts. You know, it's about learning about other people's life, how they live, you know, what they cook, how they, you know, how they behave with the nature. For example, where I come from, we do not hurt the trees. We take care of the nature because they are, we believe that they are forest gods or goddesses. You know, it's a different perspective. So our guests, they learn about it, they experience this for 10 days, and there's a transformation within them, you know, and people are always there. And in the evenings, we have these, you know, fire circle sessions, reflection time. There's so many questions. And, you know, people who are coming for these trips are interested to be transformed. So it's a beautiful way to travel, you know. We are getting transformed, and you are transforming the communities who are actually opening their arms and hearts for you to come. This is as simple as that.
Thank you so much, Poonam. And we're seeing comments in the chats that conversation's been inspirational, educational, keep the momentum going. And what I'd say is that, yep, that's on Tourism Cares, it's on the organizations that our panelists work for, but it's also on all of you in the audience to just take one step forward. If you can't, as Matt said earlier, commit to scale, then commit to at least dipping your toe in. And Tourism Cares is always happy to help connect some of the dots and connect you to resources so that you can get started. Paula, did you have anything you wanted to add, or other panelists before we begin the wrap up of our webinar?
No, John, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining, but and just to mention that these incredible change makers in our world are not necessarily on the radars of tour operators or travel advisors or DMOs even. And I think this is the challenge and the opportunity of courageous leadership to find these innovative ways to really change the lives of the communities that you're depending on and that you're profiting off of, but certainly also that your business depends on it, and so does our planet. So with that, John, I think you're just going to wrap up with a little bit more of what Tourism Cares can do to support the journey that everybody hopefully is on.
Yeah, sure. So like Paul said, want to thank everybody for being here, but we don't want to leave you with just kind of the inspiration and information you got from our panelists. We want to help provide you with some steps you can take to begin to move forward, as I was mentioning a moment ago. So over the last handful of years, Tourism Cares has been focusing on our efforts on creating tools for our members, for the USTOA community, for everybody out there in the broader travel industry to get started on their sustainability journey or to continue it. And we have had a particular focus in the last handful of years on community tourism, really trying to connect the dots between the travel trade and communities, destinations, impactful suppliers on the ground who are making a difference and who can be folded into supply chains for the benefit, not just of the destination, but of the whole industry. So one of the tools that we've been building, we've been putting a lot of focus on recently, is the Tourism Cares Meaningful Travel Map. That's a B2B tool, so it's really meant for you folks in the industry to help you easily source organizations that are making these positive social and environmental impacts in destinations. So the map is really a tool to connect you, the travel professional, with these sustainable, community-led enterprises, products, attractions, services, accommodations, all the stuff Paula was talking about earlier. We call those folks impact partners. And this is really meant to respond to the growing consumer demand for meaningful travel. So you can see the video playing right now, just kind of demonstrating the use of the map. Each of the impact partners has a profile on the map that covers what their product is, because we want to really make it immediately obvious to you what you would be buying from them. A little bit of background about their business, and then the impact that they make in their local community or on the environment. We're trying to make it really easy for you to find these amazing suppliers. So we want to encourage you to use the map when you're refreshing product or when you're creating new product from scratch. Exciting news, we've recently partnered with Thailand, and we'll be building out a map for them that should be posted by the end of the month here. We actually already have some suppliers up on the map from Thailand, and also recently partnered with Hawaii, and their map will be coming soon, hopefully by the end of the year as well. Looking forward to expanding into more destinations and bringing on more partners. For those of you who are looking to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into the design and how to build meaningful product, we have a PDF resource for you called the Guide to Meaningful Travel Product, which really goes into the why and how you can use your product to not only build amazing, memorable experiences for guests, but also to generate these positive benefits for destinations that we've been talking about today. So the examples are across meals, experiences, transportation, shopping, accommodations, and also there's examples against each one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So if you are working on some of those goals or you're looking at an effort that tackles all of them, you can utilize this resource to try to think of different things that you can do within your supply chain to really make a difference. You can access that guide through our website, under programs. We can email it to you if you want to connect in that way. But I just want to say on behalf of my colleagues at Tourism Cares, thank you so much for joining us. The ball's in your court, but we're here absolutely to support you, as is if you're a USTOA member. That whole community represented here today by Molly Lacob. And so I will pass it off to Molly to give some closing remarks. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, John. Wow, that last hour was full of tons of tangible ideas, inspiration, tools, everything. Thank you so much to the panelists for all of your honest conversations about where you're at and also what needs to be done. I think, like I said, collaboration is a real theme of the education series, and this is exactly what we're doing. We're trying to reach all corners of the travel and tourism industry. And thank you so much to Tourism Cares. This was the perfect topic to have you come on and discuss, and your questions were very inspiring, but it really got the conversation going. We don't want to end the conversation here, so we're going to have a follow-up check-in discussion on Tuesday, October 3rd at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We had this for the first session that was in August, and it was a really great opportunity for the attendees to speak and talk about what's going on in their own organizations and companies. And the whole reason this was created, so we can give, a peer learning platform for members of USTOA. Everyone's invited, Tourism Cares members, USTOA members, and that will not be recorded, that follow-up discussion. So I'm always happy to talk to you one-on-one though. So if you can't make that, please feel free to reach out to me. My information is right there on the screen, but we'd love to have you. I'll be sending out a invitation, a calendar invite for you all for that tomorrow morning. And just some upcoming education series sessions that we'll be having. We have 3 right here on the calendar and more to come. The next one's going to be Tuesday, October 10th, which we're very excited about. And we also have our USTOA Sustainability Resources Hub that you can find all this information at. And speaking of tools, starting in October, we're going to have tools from other members that will be on there available. Best practices, resources, especially Tourism Cares. They're going to be top of the list on there. So thank you to everyone for attending. This was very inspirational, and we hope to see you soon.